year 1873 had bled the sky white over New Mexico. Heat shimmered in waves from the baked red earth, distorting the horizon into a wavering line of impossible shapes. Through this unforgiving landscape, a train cut a straight, black scar, its engine puffing out plumes of gray smoke that were quickly torn apart by the dry wind and swallowed by the immense, empty blue above. The rhythmic clatter of iron wheels on iron rails was the only persistent sound for miles, a mechanical heartbeat in a land that felt ancient and indifferent to the passage of men. Inside the last car, where the sway was most pronounced and the dust thickest, sat Silas Boone. He was a man built on a scale that seemed to belong to the mountains rather than the cramped confines of a passenger train. His shoulders were broad enough to block the view from the window he sat beside, and his long legs were angled into the aisle, forcing other passengers to give him a wide berth. He had settled into the corner seat when he boarded in Santa Fe and had not moved in what felt like 2 days. He was a fixed point in a world of constant, jarring motion. His silence was the most remarkable thing about him. It was not the quiet of a man sleeping or the reserved nature of a shy traveler. It was a dense, heavy silence that seemed to have its own gravity, pulling the noise and chatter of the car towards it and deadening them. Other passengers, a family with 3 restless children, a pair of whiskey salesmen with slicked back hair, a stern-looking woman in a black bonnet had long since given up trying to engage him. A polite nod in his direction was met with a slow, steady gaze that wasn't hostile, but was so profoundly vacant of invitation that it felt like looking at a rock face. It offered no purchase. So they left him alone, this human island in their midst. He wore the clothes of a man who worked the land and expected nothing from it but hardship. His denim trousers were worn pale at the knees, patched near one pocket with a darker, sturdier swatch of fabric. His boots were scuffed and scarred, the leather cracked like dried mud, and coated in a layer of dust so fine it seemed to have become part of them. But it was his coat that drew the eye. It was a greatcoat of thick, dark wool, the kind a man might wear in a blizzard, not in the sweltering heat of a desert crossing. He wore it unbuttoned, but it hung from his massive frame like a curtain, a barrier between him and the rest of the world. It seemed to hold the cold of a winter long past. His hands, resting on his knees, were maps of a hard life. The knuckles were thick and scarred, the skin calloused and split in places that never seemed to fully heal. They were hands that had set fence posts, roped cattle, and likely held a gun with the same steady, unthinking competence. Now, they were perfectly still, the fingers slightly curled, as if holding on to something that wasn't there. His face was weathered granite. The sun had tanned his skin to a deep, dark leather, and wrinkles radiated from the corners of his eyes, etched there by years of squinting into a relentless sun. A thick, untrimmed beard, the color of dust and shot through with threads of gray, covered the lower half of his face, hiding the shape of his mouth and any expression it might have held. Only his eyes were truly visible, and they were the color of a faded blue sky just before dusk. They weren't focused on the chattering family across the aisle or the salesman's card game. They were fixed on the passing landscape, but they seemed to look straight through the blur of sand and scrub brush, seeing something far away, or perhaps long ago. The train jolted, and one of the salesmen, a portly man named Henderson, dropped a playing card. It skittered across the floorboards and came to rest against the toe of Silas's boot. Henderson hesitated, his eyes flicking from the card to the silent man. He cleared his throat. "Pardon me, friend," he said, his voice overly friendly. "Mind if I—" Silas did not move his head. His gaze did not shift from the window. For a long moment, the only sound was the click-clack of the wheels. Henderson began to sweat a little more freely. Finally, with an almost imperceptible movement, Silas drew his foot back, nudging the card into the open. Henderson scurried forward, snatched it up, and retreated to his seat with a mumbled, "Much obliged." That received no reply. He didn't try to make conversation again. The hours bled into one another. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on the tin roof of the car until the air inside was thick and suffocating. The youngest child of the family across the aisle began to cry, a thin, wailing sound that grated on the nerves. The mother tried to soothe him, her voice a low, tired murmur. Silas gave no indication he heard it. He remained a statue, his breathing slow and even, a stark contrast to the fretful energy that filled the rest of the car. He watched the land change, watched as flat, dusty plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon pine. He saw a herd of pronghorn antelope flow like a tan river across a distant ridge, their white rumps flashing in the sun before they vanished. He saw a lone rider on a weary-looking horse, a small, dark figure silhouetted against the vast, indifferent landscape. For a fleeting instant, the rider looked towards the train, and Silas wondered if the man felt as isolated out there as he did in here, surrounded by people. The thought was a flicker, a spark in the deep well of his silence, and then it was gone, extinguished by the emptiness that followed. He had been on this train for what felt like a lifetime, but it was a journey without destination. He was not traveling to a new job, or to a family, or to any kind of future he could name. He was simply moving. He had sold his ranch in Colorado, the small plot of land he had carved out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands, the house he had built, the graves he had dug, and had bought a one-way ticket south. He hadn't known where he was going, only that he had to leave. The silence of the plains had become too loud, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and the echoes of a life that had ended before it had truly begun. He had thought the noise of a train, the press of humanity, might offer some kind of relief. He had been wrong. The isolation was worse here, sharper and more defined. It was the loneliness of a man drowning in a sea of people. The conductor came through, a harried man with a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. "Tickets, tickets, please," he called, his voice tired. He punched the tickets of the family, exchanged a joke with the salesman, and then he stood before Silas. Silas did not look at him. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat, a movement that was slow and deliberate, and produced a worn piece of cardstock. The conductor took it, punched a new hole in it with a decisive snap, and handed it back. "Next stop is Lordsburg, about an hour," the conductor offered, attempting to breach the wall of silence. Silas took the ticket and returned it to his pocket. He said nothing. He didn't even nod. His gaze remained fixed on the world outside the window. The conductor sighed, a small puff of frustrated air, and moved on. As the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, it painted the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The light slanted through the dusty windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the car. The crying child had finally fallen asleep, his head lolling on his mother's shoulder. The card game had ended, and the salesmen were sharing a flask of cheap whiskey, their voices now low and conspiratorial. A fragile peace had settled over the car, the weary truce that comes at the end of a long, hard day of travel. And still, Silas sat. He was part of the shadows now, a large, dark shape in the corner that seemed to absorb the fading light. He had not eaten, not taken a sip of water, not spoken a single word since stepping onto the platform in Santa Fe. He was a man hollowed out by grief, a walking vessel of memory and silence. He existed, he breathed, he watched the world go by, but he was not a part of it. He was a ghost in a wool coat, riding a train through the heart of a desert, completely and utterly alone, cut off from the world as if by a chasm 1,000 miles wide. And in that moment, he believed that was how it would always be. He was a statue, and statues do not change. He did not know that the wind was about to shift, that a storm was coming, and that his world of silent, ordered emptiness was about to be shattered forever. The quiet of the car was not broken, but shattered. The connecting door at the front slammed open. crashing against the interior wall with a sound like a gunshot. Every head snapped up. The tired peace of the evening commute was gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of collective breath. Framed in the doorway was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18. For a frozen second, she stood there, a wild silhouette against the dim light of the next car, her chest heaving as if she had run a mile. Then she stumbled in, and the door swung shut behind her, cutting her off, sealing her in with them. She was a study in desperation. Her hair, the color of corn silk, had come undone from its braid and flew in a tangled halo around her face. A long, angry scratch marked one cheekbone, beaded with a tiny speck of dried blood. Her dress, a simple calico of faded blue, was smudged with dirt and torn near the hem, revealing a flash of a dusty petticoat beneath. But it was her eyes that held the attention of everyone in the car. They were wide, the color of a stormy sky, and they darted from face to face, not seeing people but assessing threats and searching for escape. They were the eyes of a rabbit caught in the open, every nerve screaming with terror. In one hand, she clutched a small canvas satchel to her chest, holding it with a white-knuckled grip as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was tilting and falling apart around her. The salesman, Henderson, and his companion stopped their low conversation, their mouths slightly agape. The mother across the aisle instinctively pulled her sleeping child closer, shielding him with her body. They saw a disruption, a problem, a piece of someone else's trouble that had just burst into their lives. They saw a girl who was clearly running from something, and their immediate, unspoken consensus was to not get involved. They turned their heads slightly, trying to become invisible, hoping the trouble would pass them by. The girl's frantic gaze swept over them, registering their averted eyes, their closed-off postures. She saw no help there. Her eyes continued their panicked search, moving down the length of the car, past the empty seats, until they landed on the far corner. They landed on Silas Boone. She saw what everyone else saw, a mountain of a man, still and silent, half hidden in the growing twilight. She saw the impassive face, the great wool coat, the sheer, immovable bulk of him. But where the others saw a cold and uninviting void, she saw something else. She saw a shadow. She saw a rock. She saw a place where a small, terrified thing might be able to hide. His very isolation, the empty space that surrounded him like a moat, was the most inviting thing in the room. He was separate from all of this, and she desperately needed to be separate, too. A decision made itself in her mind, born not of logic but of pure, unadulterated instinct. She took a step, then another, moving down the aisle. Her movements were not graceful. She was clumsy with fear, bumping a hip against an armrest. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent car. All eyes were on her now, watching her unsteady progress toward the corner where the big man sat, still as stone, his gaze still fixed on the darkened window as if he hadn't even noticed her entrance. She reached his seat. She stood over him, a slim, trembling figure, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. The air around him felt different still and heavy, like the air before a storm. She could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and cold earth clinging to his coat. For a moment, she hesitated, her courage failing her. He was so large, so unnervingly still. He didn't even turn his head. What if he shouted? What if he pushed her away, casting her back out into the open for whatever was coming behind her? But the sound of a distant, angry voice from another car, muffled but undeniable, spurred her on. There was no time for doubt. She leaned down, bringing her face close to his, her wild hair brushing against the rough wool of his collar. Her voice, when it came, was not a voice at all. It was a mere whisper of air, a trembling vibration that was almost lost beneath the clatter of the train wheels. It was the sound of her last hope. "Sir," she breathed, the word ragged and frail. "Can I slip under your coat?" The question hung in the space between them. It was an insane request, an intimate, desperate, and dangerous plea to a complete stranger. It offered no explanation, no context, only a raw and undeniable need for sanctuary. For the first time in 2 days, Silas moved. It wasn't much, just a slow, deliberate turn of his head until his faded blue eyes met her terrified gray ones. He saw the truth of her fear. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a game. This was a life hanging by a thread. And the thread had just been offered to him. His mind, a place that had been silent and empty for so long, was suddenly a turmoil of conflict. His first instinct, honed by years of loss and a deep-seated desire to be left alone, was to say no, to shake his head, to turn back to the window and let her and her trouble pass him by. This was not his fight. He had left his world of fights behind him. To help her would be to invite chaos into the carefully constructed emptiness of his life. It would be to connect, and connection was pain. He knew that better than anything. But then he looked into her eyes again, and he saw more than just fear. He saw a desperate fight for survival, a plea so profound it bypassed words and spoke directly to some old, buried part of him. The part of him that had once been a protector, the part of him that had failed to protect the ones he loved. The silence stretched. The girl held her breath, her eyes locked on his, her body trembling with the strain of her terror and the last dregs of her hope. He saw the tiny, almost healed scratch on her cheek. He saw the smudge of dirt on her jaw. He saw a child trying to pass as a woman, utterly alone and hunted, and something within the frozen landscape of his soul cracked. He did not speak. Words were foreign to him now, heavy and useless things. Instead, he gave his answer with a single, slow movement. His large, calloused hand, the one that had been resting on his knee, rose. It moved to the thick woolen edge of his greatcoat. His fingers curled around the fabric. He hesitated for one final, heart-stopping second. Then, he lifted it. He raised the flap of the coat, creating a dark, narrow cave between his body and the heavy wool. It was a small space, a pocket of darkness, but it was an offer. It was a yes. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped the girl's lips. A sound so quiet it was more felt than heard. She didn't need to be told twice. She moved with a fluid speed that spoke of her desperation. Ducking her head and sliding into the opening, she was surprisingly light, a slip of a thing. She pressed herself against his side, curling into a tight ball in the cramped space. Her head bowed, her canvas satchel clutched tight. Silas let the edge of the coat fall. It settled back into place, draping down to the seat, a heavy curtain of dark wool. To the rest of the car, it would look as if nothing had changed. He was still just a large man sitting in the corner, staring out the window. But now, he could feel the slight tremor of her body pressed against his ribs. He could feel the warmth of her, a startling intrusion into his cold solitude. He could feel the frantic, bird-like flutter of her heart against his side. He was no longer a statue. He was a shield. He was a hiding place. The weight he carried was no longer just the hollow ache of his own past. He now carried the physical, breathing weight of a terrified stranger. He did not know her name. He did not know what she was running from. But in that silent, momentous act, he had made her fate his own. The train rattled on into the darkness, carrying two strangers bound together by a whispered plea, their destinies now as intertwined as the threads of the heavy coat that concealed them both. The world beneath the coat was a universe of three sensations: the suffocating darkness, the rough texture of wool against her cheek, and the solid, unyielding wall of the man's body beside her. The rhythmic clatter of the train was muffled, a distant thunder. More immediate was the slow, steady beat of his heart, a deep and powerful drum against her ear. It was the only calm thing in her world. Every muscle in her own body was a wire drawn taut, screaming with the need to flee. Yet she forced herself into absolute stillness, to be invisible. She had to become a part of him, a forgotten limb, a fold in his clothing. She squeezed her eyes shut, concentrating on the slow rhythm of his breathing, trying to match her own frantic, shallow gasps to his. Silas felt her. He felt the fine, terrified trembling that vibrated through her small frame and into his own. He felt the dampness of her cheek where it pressed against his shirt, a spot of warmth spreading through the fabric. It was an unwelcome and deeply unsettling intimacy. For years, he had cultivated a void around himself, an emptiness that no one could penetrate. Now, that void had been filled by this slip of a girl, and her terror was a palpable thing, seeping into him, demanding a response. He kept his eyes on the darkening landscape outside, the jagged silhouettes of mesas against a bruised purple sky, but he was no longer seeing them. His awareness had collapsed into the small, dark space he had created. To the frantic life he was now shielding. The fragile quiet was broken by a new sound. It wasn't the scuffing of a passenger's shoes or the tired tread of the conductor. It was the heavy, rhythmic fall of booted feet. 3 sets of them. They moved with a purpose that was utterly alien to the weary drift of travel. It was the sound of men walking on their own ground, men who were not asking permission. It was the sound of predators. The girl's trembling ceased. She went utterly, rigidly still, a stillness born not of calm but of absolute terror. Her breathing stopped entirely. Silas felt the change instantly. The sudden tension in the muscles pressed against his side. He didn't need to be told. The hunters had arrived. The car door opened again, not with a crash this time, but with a firm, deliberate push. 3 men stepped inside, and the temperature in the car seemed to drop. They paused just inside the doorway, their eyes scanning the length of the car, their presence filling the space with a palpable menace. The man in the lead was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with a lean, wolfish face and eyes the color of chipped slate. A stained duster hung from his narrow shoulders, and his lips were a thin, cruel line beneath a drooping mustache. He was the one in charge. It was in the confident, proprietary way he held himself. The 2 men flanking him were younger, broader, and cut from a rougher cloth. One had a thick neck and a vacant, brutal expression. The other was wiry and restless, his hand hovering near the butt of the pistol holstered on his hip. They were dogs on a leash, and the older man held the chain. No one spoke. The salesman, Henderson, and his partner suddenly found their boots intensely interesting. The mother across the aisle pulled a thin shawl higher around her sleeping child, her face pale. The air grew thick with unspoken fear. These were not lawmen. They were the kind of trouble that sensible people made themselves small to avoid. The lead man, Barlow, began to move down the aisle, his boots making soft, menacing thuds on the floorboards. His gaze was methodical, sweeping over each passenger, dismissing them one by one. He was looking for something specific. He was looking for a scared rabbit, and this car was the burro. His eyes passed over the salesman, who visibly flinched. He glanced at the woman and child, a flicker of contempt crossing his face. His gaze continued, moving inexorably toward the back of the car. It landed on Silas. Beneath the coat, the girl felt as if a physical hand had closed around her heart. She could feel the man's eyes on them, a tangible weight. She fought the overwhelming urge to shrink, to burrow deeper. Any movement, any sound, and she was lost. She held the breath in her lungs until they burned, her world reduced to the desperate prayer that this rock she was hiding behind would be big enough, solid enough, to keep her hidden. Barlow's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the scene. He saw a large, solitary man, dressed in a heavy winter coat that was out of place in the desert heat. He saw a man who looked worn down by the world, staring out the window with a profound lack of interest. There was nothing overtly suspicious, yet the man's very stillness, his sheer size, made him a possibility, a place to hide. Barlow took a slow step closer. The 2 younger men fanned out behind him, their expressions watchful. "Evening," Barlow said, his voice a low drawl that was more threat than greeting. Silas did not respond. He did not move. He did not so much as blink. He continued to stare out the window, his expression as blank and unreadable as a weathered stone. He knew the man was talking to him, but he gave no sign of it. To acknowledge him would be to engage. To engage would be to reveal. He had to be nothing more than a feature of the landscape, a piece of the furniture. Barlow waited a beat, a small, cruel smile touching the corner of his mouth. He was not used to being ignored. "Lost your hearing, friend," he pressed, his voice a little sharper now. "Or just rude?" Silas felt the girl's body go rigid, a single, long shiver of pure terror running through her. He remained impassive. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he turned his head from the window. He did not look at Barlow's face. He looked at the knot in the man's neckerchief, a point in the middle distance. His eyes were flat, empty of fear, anger, or curiosity. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the end of the world and had not been impressed. There was no challenge in his gaze, but there was also no submission. There was nothing. It was like staring into a well on a moonless night. The confrontation stretched into a long, silent moment. The only sound was the clicking of the rails. Barlow studied Silas, trying to find a crack, a flicker of nervousness, a sign of deceit. He found none. He saw only a vast, weary emptiness. This big man wasn't hiding anything. He was just dead inside. A man like that was more trouble than he was worth. Barlow was hunting a scared girl, not looking for a brawl with a walking corpse. With a soft snort of disgust, Barlow broke the stare. He turned away. "Waste of time," he muttered to his men. "Check the next car." He strode to the end of the car and shoved the door open, his two men following like shadows. The door swung shut behind them, and the suffocating tension in the car eased, replaced by a wave of shaky, silent relief. The girl under the coat finally let out the breath she had been holding in a long, shuddering sigh. Her muscles, which had been clenched as hard as iron, began to tremble uncontrollably in the aftermath of the strain. It was over. They were gone. Silas remained still, listening. He knew it wasn't over. Men like that did not give up so easily. He felt the girl begin to relax against him, a dangerous, premature surrender. He wanted to tell her to stay quiet, to stay still, but the words wouldn't come. He had forgotten how to use them. And then it came, a shout from outside the train, carried on the wind. The voice was faint but clear, filled with triumphant rage. "Barlow, I found her tracks. She jumped cars back by the crossing. She's on this train." The words were a death sentence. Every passenger in the car heard it. The brief moment of relief was obliterated. The mother across the aisle let out a small, terrified gasp. The connecting door at the end of the car crashed open again. Barlow stood there, his face transformed into a mask of fury. The pretense of civility was gone. His eyes, now hard and sharp as nails, flew directly to the back corner, to the one place he had dismissed, to the large, silent man in the ridiculously heavy coat. He knew. He strode back down the aisle, his steps heavy and final. There was no more scanning, no more questions. He was coming for them. The two younger men blocked the aisle behind him, cutting off any escape. The girl's body was seized by a fresh wave of terror so profound it was like a physical blow. A small, choked whimper escaped her lips. Barlow was 5 feet away, 4. His hand moved towards the lapel of his duster, where the handle of a pistol protruded. In that instant, the dam of Silas's silence finally broke. He moved. It was not a sudden, panicked reaction, but a deep, decisive shift, like a mountainside giving way. His head turned, and his eyes, no longer empty, met the girl's terrified ones through the gap in his coat. His voice, when it came, was a low, rough sound, rusty from disuse, but it was filled with an absolute, unquestionable authority. "Hold tight," he commanded. Before the girl could even process the shock of him speaking, his arm, a band of iron, wrapped around her. With a single, explosive movement, he was on his feet, pulling her up and out from her hiding place. He moved with a speed and power that was shocking in a man his size. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look at Barlow. He yanked the girl with him, half lifting her off her feet, and lunged for the opposite side of the train car, away from the blocked aisle. His target was the other door, the one that led out onto the narrow platform between the cars. It was their only chance. They were no longer hiding. They were running. The world dissolved into a chaos of roaring wind and splintering wood. Silas didn't just open the side door. He put his shoulder into it, smashing it outward against its latch. For a split second, the girl saw the blur of the darkening landscape, a terrifying, speeding smear of rock and sand. There was no time to think, no time to scream. His arm was a vice around her waist, and his voice, that low, rough command. "Hold tight," was the only anchor in the world that had come unmoored. Then he leaped, pulling her with him into the abyss. They didn't so much jump as they were thrown from the train, flung into the violent, rushing air. The ground came up at them with brutal speed. Silas twisted his body in midair, a massive, instinctual act of shielding. He took the impact, his broad back and shoulder absorbing the crushing force as they hit the gravel embankment. The world became a dizzying, violent tumble of grit, thorns, and pain. They rolled, a tangle of limbs, down the steep slope. Rocks tore at Silas's coat, and thorny branches ripped at the girl's dress and scraped her skin, leaving fiery trails of pain. The breath was knocked from her lungs in a silent gasp, her vision filled with a spinning vortex of earth and sky. They came to a jarring halt at the bottom of the embankment in a cloud of red dust. For a moment, there was only the ringing in her ears and the searing pain that seemed to radiate from every part of her body. The train was already receding, its clatter growing fainter, but the angry shouts of the men carried clearly on the wind. They were slowing the train. They would be coming back. Before the girl could even register a coherent thought, Silas was moving. He untangled himself from her, a low groan escaping his lips as he pushed himself onto one knee. There was a long, bloody gash on his forearm, where a sharp rock had found its mark. He ignored it. His face was a mask of grim, focused urgency. He looked at her, his eyes clear and hard. "Up," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs felt like they were filled with wet sand. A sob of pain and fear caught in her throat. He didn't offer a gentle hand. He reached down, grabbed her by the arm, and hauled her to her feet. The world swayed, and she stumbled, but his grip was like iron, holding her steady. He didn't give her a moment to catch her breath or assess her injuries. He just started running, dragging her along with him, away from the tracks and into the labyrinth of rocks and shadows that stretched out before them. Their flight was a desperate, painful scramble. The ground was uneven, littered with loose stones that turned under their feet. Thorny mesquite and catclaw acacia tore at their clothes and skin. The girl's simple shoes were no match for the terrain, and she felt sharp rocks digging into the soles of her feet. Every breath was a fire in her lungs. Twice she fell, her knees hitting the hard ground, and twice Silas pulled her back up without breaking stride, his relentless forward momentum forcing her to keep moving. He didn't speak, didn't offer a word of encouragement. His actions were his only language: we move, or we die. He seemed to navigate the treacherous landscape with an instinct she couldn't comprehend. He kept to the low ground, using the deepening shadows of the gullies and the hulking shapes of red rock formations as cover. He moved not with grace, but with an unstoppable, ground-eating purpose, his large body a battering ram against the hostile wilderness. Behind them, the sounds of the pursuit grew more organized. A whistle blew, sharp and piercing. They heard the men calling to each other, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. They were spreading out, hunting. The girl's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. They could hear them. They were too loud, too slow. Silas seemed to know this. He suddenly veered to the right, pulling her down into a shallow depression where a cluster of dry, brittle tumbleweeds had collected against a rock face. He pushed her down behind the rock, his hand on her shoulder signaling for her to stay put. He surveyed the area for a moment, his eyes scanning the landscape. Then, he began to act with a strange, methodical calm. He gathered a pile of the driest grasses and tumbleweeds, adding dead, brittle twigs from a skeletal-looking bush. He reached into his pocket and produced a small tin box. From it, he took a single lucifer match. In the fading light, the scrape of the match head against the rough stone was unnaturally loud. A tiny flame flared to life, casting a flickering, demonic glow on his weathered face. He touched the flame to the base of the pile. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a tiny curl of smoke rose, followed by a sudden, hungry whoosh as the dry tinder caught fire. The flames licked upward, consuming the tumbleweeds in a furious crackle. A thick, acrid cloud of gray-white smoke billowed into the air, caught by the evening breeze and dragged across the landscape like a dirty curtain. It was a beacon. Yes, but it was also a screen. It would draw their eyes, and it would obscure the path they were about to take. "Now," he grunted, grabbing her arm again. He pulled her away from the fire, plunging them deeper into a narrow, winding wash carved into the earth by 1,000 years of flash floods. The smoke was already spreading, a choking, blinding fog that would confuse their scent and their line of sight. They ran on, their footsteps muffled by the soft sand of the wash. The stone walls rose on either side of them, swallowing the last of the daylight, enclosing them in a world of deep purple shadow. They ran until the girl's legs were numb, and her lungs felt as if they were about to burst. The sounds of the pursuit grew fainter, distorted by the rock and distance. The men would be investigating the fire, their attention drawn to the diversion. It had bought them time. Finally, Silas stopped. He had found what he was looking for. It was a deep cut in the side of the wash, an alcove carved out by a swirling eddy of water long ago. It was barely large enough for the two of them, a dark cleft in the rock. He pushed her inside, then squeezed in after her, his body pressing them deep into the shadows. They stood there, chests heaving, their ragged breaths sounding like thunder in the enclosed space. The adrenaline that had fueled their flight began to recede, and in its place, a crushing wave of pain and exhaustion washed over the girl. Her ankles throbbed, her knees were raw and bleeding, and 1,000 tiny cuts from the thorns burned like fire. They listened. The silence of the desert night descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind over the top of the wash. Far in the distance, they heard one last, frustrated shout, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the immense emptiness of the land. Then, nothing. The sounds of the hunt had faded. For now, they were safe. They were alone. The realization did not bring relief, only a profound sense of hopelessness. They were in the middle of nowhere, with nothing. The girl's strength, held together by fear and adrenaline, finally shattered. Her legs gave out from under her, and she slid down the rock wall to a crumpled heap on the sandy floor. The fight was gone, replaced by a cold, leaden despair. She looked up at the sliver of star-dusted sky visible from their hiding place. It looked impossibly far away. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She wrapped her arms around her knees, her body shaking with a silent, racking sob. "I can't," she whispered, the words a broken exhalation of defeat, addressed to the silent man, to the uncaring desert, to herself. "I can't go on." Silas stood over her, a massive, dark silhouette against the faint light. He did not kneel down. He did not offer a comforting touch or a soft word. He simply looked down at the defeated girl at his feet, his face an unreadable mask of shadow. After a long moment, his voice cut through the darkness, as rough and unyielding as the rock surrounding them. It was not a suggestion. It was a verdict. "You can," his two words, "you can were not a comfort. They were a command. As hard and unforgiving as the desert itself, they were also, she realized with a dawning, terrible clarity, the truth. She had no other choice. To stay here was to surrender. To get up was to live another minute, another hour. And so, fueled by the last embers of her will and the unyielding presence of the man standing over her, she got up. The rest of the night was a walking dream, a nightmare of stumbling through darkness. Silas led them on, not back towards the railroad, but deeper into the wilderness, following a path that was invisible to her. He moved with a slow, relentless rhythm, his greatcoat a moving shadow ahead of her. The stars were a brilliant, cold spray across the black sky, offering no warmth, only a faint light to distinguish the shapes of the rocks from the deeper shadows of the ravines. The cold of the desert night sank deep into her bones, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of the day. Her torn dress offered little protection. She wrapped her arms around herself, her teeth chattering, but she never made a sound. Complaining felt like a luxury she had not earned, and he would not heed. Just before the first hint of dawn, when the sky in the east had turned from black to a bruised charcoal, he stopped. He had led them to a small, hidden spring, a seep of water that trickled from a fissure in a rock wall, collecting in a shallow, stone-lined pool. It was a miracle. He knelt, cupped his large, scarred hands, and drank deeply. Then he looked at her, a silent order. She fell to her knees, the sharp pain in them a distant concern, and plunged her face into the icy water, drinking until her throat ached. The water was clean and cold and tasted of life itself. It washed the dust from her face and the despair from her spirit. If only for a moment. Silas reached into an inner pocket of his coat and produced a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He undid it to reveal a few strips of dried beef, hard and dark. He tore one in half and handed her a piece. She took it with numb fingers. It was tough and salty, and she had to chew it for a long time. But it was food. It was sustenance. They ate in silence as the sky slowly brightened, the stars fading one by one. They were two survivors sharing a meager sacrament in the vast, silent cathedral of the desert. As light filled the world, she saw him clearly for the first time since the train. His face was grim, etched with exhaustion. The gash on his arm had bled through his shirt sleeve, a dark, ugly stain. But his eyes were alert, constantly scanning their surroundings. There was no softness in him, no pity. There was only an immense, weary competence. He was a creature of this harsh land, and as long as she stayed with him, she might just survive it. When they had finished, he stood. "Come," he said, his first word since the wash, and they walked on. They walked all day. The sun climbed, beating down on them, but Silas never seemed to notice. He set a punishing pace, but it was steady, a pace he could maintain for hours. He led them through a landscape that would have been beautiful if she were not so terrified. They traversed wide, sun-bleached plains, climbed through rugged canyons of red rock that rose like ancient, ruined cities, and descended into sandy arroyos where the air was still and hot. He was taking them somewhere. This was not a random flight. It was a journey with a destination. The thought provided a tiny, fragile sliver of hope that she clung to with all her might. Late in the afternoon, when she felt she could not take another step, that her blistered feet would simply refuse to move, he led her up the side of a low mesa. From the top, the world opened up below them, and there, nestled in a wide, shallow valley that was a surprising splash of dusty green in the vast ocean of brown and red, was a ranch. It was not a grand place. It was a small, solitary outpost of humanity against the overwhelming wilderness. A simple, one-story house built of sun-bleached timber and adobe bricks sat in the center, its porch roof sagging slightly on one side, a skeletal-looking corral, its fences in need of mending. stood beside a battered, sway-backed barn. A lone windmill turned slowly, its creak a faint, lonely sound on the wind. The whole place looked worn down by sun and wind, as if it were slowly being reclaimed by the desert. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen, and yet the sight of the smoking chimney, a thin plume of gray against the blue sky, made her want to weep with relief. It was a home. It was a place to stop. Silas stood beside her, looking down at the valley. He watched her face, saw the exhaustion and the dawning comprehension in her eyes. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and devoid of any pride or sentiment. It was a simple statement of fact. My place. The walk down into the valley was the longest of her life. With every step, a bit more of the tension drained from her body, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it was a physical weight. When they finally reached the dusty yard in front of the house, she felt as if she might collapse. Silas didn't go to the house. He walked to the water pump near the windmill and began to work the handle with long, rhythmic strokes. The sound was a loud, rhythmic squeak and clank. Water, clear and cold, gushed from the spout into a wooden trough. He gestured for her to drink. She didn't need to be told. She drank from the trough like an animal, the cold water splashing on her face and down the front of her filthy dress. When she had her fill, she simply stood there, dripping and swaying on her feet, not knowing what to do next. She looked at her hands. They were filthy, her nails broken, her knuckles scraped raw. She looked at her dress, torn and stained. She felt a sudden, overwhelming need to do something, anything, to impose some small measure of order on the chaos that had been her life for the past few days. It was an instinct, a desperate need to feel useful, to not be just a piece of helpless baggage this silent man had been forced to carry. On the porch, a worn-out broom leaned against the wall. Without thinking, she walked over, picked it up, and began to sweep. The rhythmic scrape of the bristles on the dusty wooden planks was a deeply satisfying sound. She swept away the dirt, the fallen leaves, the debris of the desert, creating a small, clean space. It was a tiny act of defiance against the wildness that surrounded them, and it grounded her. When she finished the porch, she saw the chicken coop. The door hung crookedly from one hinge, and a few boards were loose. She found a heavy rock and, using it as a hammer, began to painstakingly knock the boards back into place. Her hands were clumsy, and she struck her thumb once, a sharp jolt of pain that brought tears to her eyes. But she didn't stop. She worked with a single-minded focus, losing herself in the simple, physical task. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the screen door of the house creak open. She didn't notice the small figure that emerged and stood watching her, silent and serious. It was only when she finally managed to wedge the last board into place and stood up, brushing the dust from her hands, that she saw him. A little boy. He was perhaps 6 years old, with a thatch of dusty brown hair and eyes the same faded blue as Silas's. He was small for his age, with a solemn, watchful face that seemed too old for his small body. He wore a simple, patched-up shirt and trousers that were a little too short for him. He stood perfectly still, just inside the doorway, his small hands clasped behind his back, regarding her with an unwavering, curious gaze. He was not afraid, just studying her. They looked at each other for a long moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the creak of the windmill and the distant cry of a hawk. The boy took a hesitant step forward, then another. He stopped a few feet from her, his head tilted. "You're not a ghost," he said. His voice was small and clear, a statement of fact, not a question. The words were so unexpected, so strangely profound, that they broke through the wall of fear and exhaustion she had built around her heart. A sound bubbled up in her chest, a strange, rusty noise. And then she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, fragile curve of her lips. But it was the first time she had smiled in days, perhaps weeks. It felt foreign and wonderful. a muscle she had forgotten how to use. The simple, innocent honesty of a child had reached her in a way nothing else could have. "No," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'm not a ghost." The boy, Tom, seemed satisfied with this. He gave a single solemn nod and then turned and ran back into the house. A moment later, Silas came out. He had washed his face and arms at the pump, and the gash on his forearm was now crudely but cleanly wrapped with a strip of cloth. He carried a wooden bucket of water. He walked past her without a word and went into the barn. The girl, whose name was Ellie, stood in the yard, her smile fading but a warmth remaining in its place. The presence of the child changed everything. This was not just a desolate refuge for a broken man. It was a home with a little boy. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. For the rest of the evening, Silas remained a silent, watchful presence, while she found the kindling box and managed to coax a small, hesitant fire to life in the main room's stone fireplace. He was outside, methodically oiling the squeaking pump of the windmill, while she explored the small, sparse kitchen and found a sack of beans and a side of bacon. He was in the corral, testing the strength of the fence posts. He never spoke to her, never looked at her directly for more than a second, but she felt his awareness of her constantly. It was not a threatening presence. It was the watchfulness of a guardian, a sentinel making sure the perimeter was secure. Every one of his quiet, deliberate actions seemed to be a brick in a wall he was building around this small, isolated place. A wall to keep the world out, a wall to keep them safe. Later, when darkness had fallen completely, she found a clean, patched-up man's shirt and a worn but sturdy blanket folded neatly on a chair just inside a small, stark room that contained nothing but a simple cot. It was her room. He had prepared it for her. A lump formed in her throat. She went back to the main room. A plate with a steaming pile of beans and 2 strips of fried bacon sat on the rough-hewn wooden table, along with a tin cup of water. He had made it for her. He was nowhere to be seen. He had given her food, shelter, and privacy. He had given her everything, and he had asked for nothing, not even her name. She sat down at the table, alone in the quiet house, the firelight flickering on the walls, and for the first time since she had stumbled onto that train, she ate a meal without fear. The exhaustion was still there, a deep ache in her bones, but beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of peace had begun to take root. Ellie woke to a world of stillness, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She had not been jolted from sleep by the rattling of a train car or the cold terror of being hunted. She had simply slept deeply. The small room was filled with a soft, gray morning light filtering through the single, dusty window pane. A cot, a blanket, 4 simple walls. It was a fortress. She lay there for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new reality, the distant, rhythmic creak of the windmill, the faint cluck of a chicken in the yard, the whisper of wind around the corners of the house. There were no human sounds. The silence that emanated from the rest of the house was as profound as the man who created it. She rose, her body a map of aches and bruises from their flight and fall. But the pains were dull, distant. She put on the clean, patched shirt Silas had left for her. It was huge, smelling faintly of soap and sun-dried cotton, and wearing it felt like wrapping herself in a piece of his quiet strength. Hesitantly, she ventured out of her room. The main room was empty. The fire from last night now, a bed of pale, glowing embers. A tin plate with a piece of cornbread sat on the table. For her. She found Silas outside, mending a leather harness by the barn. His large hands, which she had seen move with such surprising speed and force, were now slow and precise, working an awl and waxed thread through the thick leather. He acknowledged her presence with a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his head, his eyes never leaving his work. His son, Tom, sat on the ground nearby, meticulously arranging a line of smooth, gray stones. He looked up at Ellie, his expression as serious as his father's. then went back to his task. She didn't know the rules of this place, the rhythm of their lives, but she knew she couldn't be idle. She was living on a debt she could never repay, and the only currency she had was her own 2 hands. She spent the morning in what she guessed was a small vegetable garden, a parched, neglected square of earth near the house. It was mostly weeds, but a few tenacious squash vines and bean plants were still clinging to life. She pulled the weeds, her hands growing sore and dirty, her mind blessedly empty, focused only on the task of clearing the earth. She worked until the sun was high and hot, finding a strange comfort in the honest, mindless labor. The day passed in this way, a slow, quiet orbit of 3 solitary people. They ate a midday meal of beans and the cornbread in the same manner as her breakfast food appearing on the table, eaten in near total silence. Tom was the only one who spoke, his childish observations falling into the quiet like pebbles into a deep well. "The hawk is back," he said once, pointing to a dark speck circling high in the sky. Silas only grunted in response, but Ellie saw his gaze follow the bird for a long moment. That evening, after another silent supper, Ellie began to clear the plates. It was something she had always done, a habit from a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. She carried the tin plates and cups to a dry sink in the corner of the kitchen, a simple basin with a hand pump next to it. She worked the pump, and after a few squeaking protests, water trickled out. She heated a kettle over the fire and poured the steaming water into the basin, adding a small sliver of harsh lye soap. The warmth of the water on her chapped hands was a small, profound comfort. She submerged the plates, the repetitive, circular motion of washing them a soothing balm. It was in this small, domestic moment, with the house quiet and the last light of day fading outside the window, that the words finally came. She hadn't planned to speak, but the fragile peace of the house, the quiet acceptance of this strange, silent man, had somehow created a space safe enough for the truth to escape. She was watching her hands move in the soapy water when she began, her voice low and unsteady, barely more than a whisper. "My father," she started, and then stopped. She scrubbed at a plate that was already clean, her knuckles white. Silas was sitting at the table, cleaning the bore of a rifle with a practiced, methodical calm. He didn't look up, but she felt his stillness change, his attention focusing on her. "He has a small farm, north of here. The drought. It took almost everything." She took a shaky breath and continued, her eyes still fixed on the basin. "There's a man, Barlow. He owns the largest saloon in the county. He owns a lot of things. A lot of people owe him." She paused, the memory a bitter taste in her mouth. "My father was one of them." She set the clean plate on the wooden drain board and picked up another. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the soft splash of the water. Barlow came to the farm one day. He said he would forgive my father's debt. He said he needed a wife. Her hands stilled in the water. "So my father, he made an arrangement. He called it a marriage." She finally looked up from the sink, not at Silas, but at the dark reflection of the room in the window pane. Her own face was a pale, haunted oval. It wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction. I was the price. She told him the rest in a flat, emotionless voice, the voice of someone who has gone over the story so many times in her own mind that the horror has been worn smooth. She told him about the ceremony, a quick, grim affair in the saloon owner's office with a circuit judge who looked bored. She told him about the heavy gold ring Barlow had pushed onto her finger, how it felt cold and heavy, like a manacle. "He didn't want a wife," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "He wanted something to own, something young that he could show off, that everyone knew belonged to him. That first night, I waited until he was asleep. I took the ring off. I thought maybe I could sell it. I took the few coins he'd left on the dresser and I just ran. I didn't have a plan. I just ran until I got to the next town and used the money to buy a ticket for a train. Any train, just to go south." She looked down at her hands. bare now, except for the scrapes and cuts. The ring is all I have left of that. I buried it, out there, in the desert. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. She took a final, shuddering breath. The confession now complete. Barlow is a proud man. He wouldn't stand for being made a fool of, for having his property run away. They've been chasing me since that night. She finished the last plate and let the soapy water drain out of the basin, the gurgling sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She stood there, her back to him, her shoulders slumped, feeling empty and exposed. She had laid the full, ugly weight of her trouble at his feet. She expected him to say something, to ask a question, to tell her she couldn't stay, that she had brought too much danger to his home. She braced herself for the judgment, for the dismissal. Instead, she heard the scrape of a chair on the wooden floor. Heavy, booted footsteps approached. She didn't turn. She felt him stop just behind her. He reached past her, his arm brushing against hers, and picked up a clean, dry cloth from a hook on the wall. And then, he took the first wet plate from the drain board and began to dry it. He didn't say a word. He just stood beside her, a massive, silent presence, and took on the other half of her simple task. She washed, he dried. They fell into a slow, unspoken rhythm. The soft scrape of the cloth against the tin plates was the only sound. It was a gesture so simple, so profound in its quiet solidarity, that it brought a hot sting of tears to her eyes. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't pitying her. He was simply standing with her, in that moment, drying dishes in the dim light of a lonely ranch house. He was telling her, without words, that she was not alone in this. Her burden was now, in some small way, shared. Later that night, Ellie lay on her cot, unable to sleep. Her confession had been a release, but it had also stirred up the fear, making it fresh and raw again. Outside, the wind had picked up, a low, mournful moan as it swept down from the mountains and across the valley. It was the sound of utter loneliness. The window in her room was old, its frame loose, and it began to rattle with every gust of wind. The small, persistent noise was a physical manifestation of the unease that trembled inside her. Rattle, rattle, rattle. A sound of insecurity, of a flimsy barrier against the vast, dark world outside. She turned on her side, pulling the blanket tighter around her, but the sound was impossible to ignore. It seemed to be getting louder, a nervous, frantic tapping that grated on her already frayed nerves. She sat up, thinking she might try to wedge a piece of cloth into the frame to silence it. She looked towards the window, a pale rectangle in the darkness, and then she saw him. A large, dark shape moved outside the window. Her heart leaped into her throat, the old terror surging back in a sickening wave. But it wasn't Barlow. It was Silas. He was standing outside her room in the windy darkness. He wasn't looking in. His back was to the window. He was working. She watched, frozen, as he produced a length of leather cord from his pocket. In the faint starlight, she could just make out his large, competent hands as he looped the cord around the loose part of the window sash and secured it to a nail on the outer wall. He pulled it taut, testing it once, twice. The rattling stopped. The window was now silent, held firm against the wind. He stood there for a moment, his head tilted as if listening to ensure his repair had worked. Then, satisfied, he turned and walked away, his form melting back into the shadows of the yard. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't asked. He hadn't announced his presence. He had simply heard a problem, a sound of distress, of a weakness in the defenses, and he had fixed it. He had stood guard over her sleep and mended the breach. Ellie lay back down on her cot, the only sound now the distant, muted howl of the wind. The house was quiet. Her room was secure. A profound and overwhelming sense of safety washed over her, a feeling so foreign she had almost forgotten what it was like. Silas's actions spoke a language clearer than any words. in the quiet competence of his hands, in his silent, tireless watchfulness. He had made her a solemn promise. "You are in my home. You are under my protection. The world will not get in. You will not be abandoned." The days that followed settled into a fragile, unspoken routine, a life measured not in hours but in small, quiet tasks. Ellie learned the contours of this quiet world. She learned the specific groan the windmill made when the wind shifted south. She learned that Tom, despite his solemn exterior, would chase grasshoppers with a silent, single-minded intensity for hours. And she learned the vast and varied language of Silas's silence. There was the silence of concentration when he mended a broken tool, the silence of watchfulness when he stood on the porch at dusk, his eyes scanning the horizon, and the quiet, almost peaceful silence when he sat with Tom in the evenings, carving a piece of scrap wood into the rough shape of a horse. Peace, she discovered, was not a grand, sweeping feeling. It was a collection of tiny, ordinary moments. It was the warmth of the sun on her back as she hung clean laundry on the line, the simple clothes flapping like prayer flags in the dry breeze. It was the smell of baking cornbread filling the small house. It was the sound of Tom's small, serious voice as he told her the names he'd given the stones he collected. In this lonely valley, surrounded by a harsh and unforgiving land, she had found a strange and unexpected sanctuary. The terror of her past was still there, a coiled snake in the back of her mind, but it was dormant, lulled to sleep by the steady, predictable rhythm of her days. It was on one such morning, a day so bright and clear the sky was a painful, brilliant blue, that the snake awoke. Ellie was at the clothesline, a wooden basket at her feet, a clothespin held between her teeth. The air was warm, and the clean, damp smell of Silas's shirt filled her senses as she stretched to pin it to the line. Tom was in the yard, a few feet away, trying to teach a horned lizard to stand on its hind legs. The scene was so utterly, profoundly peaceful that it felt like a painting. It was a life she had never dared to imagine for herself. Her eyes drifted to the ridge that rimmed the valley, a habit she had picked up from Silas. It was a subconscious act now, a constant check of the horizon, and that's when she saw them. At first, they were just 3 dark specks against the sharp blue of the sky, shimmering in the heat haze. She blinked, thinking they were vultures, but they weren't circling. They were moving, descending, horsemen. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced the warm bubble of her peace. She stood frozen, the damp shirt still clutched in her hand, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. They were still too far away to make out any details, but she didn't need to. She knew. An animal knows its predator. Silas emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket of feed. He saw her standing there, unnaturally still, her face turned toward the ridge. He followed her gaze. His body went rigid, the bucket of feed forgotten in his hand. He didn't need to see their faces. He knew them by their shape, by the arrogant way they sat their horses, by the simple, brutal fact of their presence in his valley. The world, which had been so quiet and peaceful, was suddenly filled with a single, roaring sound in Ellie's ears. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. The horsemen were closer now, their forms solidifying into the familiar, hated shapes of Barlow and his 2 hired thugs. Then Silas's voice cut through her paralysis. Not a command this time, but a raw, desperate roar that was torn from the deepest part of him. "Ellie, take Tom inside now." The sound shattered the morning. It was the voice of a man who saw his world about to be burned to the ground. It was the voice of pure, protective fury. Tom, startled by the shout, looked up from his lizard, his small face a mask of confusion. Ellie didn't hesitate. She dropped the shirt, scooped the boy into her arms, and ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her bare feet pounding against the hard-packed earth. Tom was a solid, terrified weight in her arms. his small hands clutching her shirt. She heard Silas behind her, his heavy boots thudding on the ground. She reached the porch, threw open the screen door, and stumbled inside. Silas right behind her. He slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the thick iron bolt across it. The sound echoed in the small house like the closing of a tomb. They were trapped. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and Tom's frightened whimpers. Then, the outside world intruded. The thundering of hooves grew louder, closer, until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. They heard the horses stop in the yard, the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of boots hitting the ground. Boone Barlow's voice was a lazy, confident drawl, amplified by the thin wooden walls. "I know she's in there. Send out my property, and we can all forget this happened. You have my word." Silas stood in the center of the room, his body a coiled spring of violence. He ignored Barlow completely. His eyes darted around the room, assessing, planning. He pointed to the small root cellar door in the floor. "Take the boy. Get in there. Do not come out." But it was too late. Before Ellie could move, a heavy boot crashed against the front door. The wood splintered. Another crash, and the bolt tore from the frame. The door flew open, and the three men filled the doorway, blocking out the light. The ensuing moments were a blur of savage, chaotic motion. Silas didn't wait for them to enter. He met them at the threshold, a silent, raging force of nature. He hit the first man, the thick-necked one, with a closed fist, a blow that made a sickening, wet crack. The man crumpled to the porch without a sound. But there were two more. The wiry one slipped past Silas's guard, a long, wicked-looking knife flashing in his hand. He lunged, but Silas moved with that deceptive speed, turning the man's momentum against him and slamming him into the wall. It was Barlow who ended it, while Silas was occupied with the second man. Barlow stepped inside, a heavy, sawn-off piece of wood, a fence post in his hand. He swung it in a vicious arc. A coward's blow from the side. The wood connected with the back of Silas's head with a sickening thud. Silas's eyes went wide for a second, a look of pure, animal surprise on his face. Then he swayed. His knees buckled, and he fell to the floor like a great tree, landing with a heavy, final sound. He lay still, a trickle of dark blood beginning to pool in the dust beneath his head. A scream built in Ellie's throat, but it died before it could escape. The wiry man, gasping for breath, saw his chance. Silas was down. The only thing left was the boy. He lunged across the room, past the fallen man, and grabbed Tom. He spun the boy around, clamping a hand over his mouth and pressing the cold, flat blade of his knife against the child's small, pale throat. "That's enough of that," Barlow said, his chest heaving. He nudged Silas's still form with the toe of his boot. "Now, the girl. Come here." Ellie was frozen, her back pressed against the far wall. The world had shrunk to the terrifying tableau before her, the man she had come to see as an unmovable mountain, lying broken and unconscious on the floor. The little boy, his eyes wide with a terror no child should ever know, a knife at his throat, and Barlow, his face a smug mask of victory. Her mind was a white-hot scream of panic. There was nowhere to run. It was over. They had won. And then she saw it, on the wall. Mounted on two wooden pegs above the stone fireplace was Silas's rifle, a long, heavy Winchester. She had seen him clean it, but she had never seen him hold it. It was a part of the house, a piece of the man. It was their only hope. I said, "Come here," Barlow repeated, taking a step toward her. In that instant, a desperate, feral courage she never knew she possessed took over. She wasn't thinking. She was acting. She lunged for the fireplace, her hands scrambling for the rifle. It was heavier than she could have imagined, cold and alien in her grasp. She pulled it from the pegs and turned, fumbling with the unfamiliar weight. She didn't know how to aim. She didn't even know if it was loaded. She just raised it, the long barrel shaking violently in her trembling hands, and pointed it in the direction of the men. Barlow stopped, a look of surprised amusement on his face. "Well now, look at the little kitten. Found her claws." The man holding Tom laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's shaking so hard she's like to shoot herself." Ellie's world narrowed to the small metal sight at the end of the barrel. It wavered, dancing a frantic jig over the man holding Tom. Her finger found the trigger. It felt cold, impossibly far away. She couldn't do it. She couldn't take a life. Her mind screamed, but her body was locked in a paralysis of terror. It was at that moment that a new voice entered the standoff, a voice as dry and cracked as the desert earth. "I dropped the boy, friend, if you're partial to that arm." Every head, except for Ellie's, snapped toward the back of the house. Standing in the doorway that led from the kitchen was a man she had never seen before. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his back bent with age. But in his gnarled hands, he held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles looking like two dark, yawning caves. He was Raoul, the old ranch hand who lived in the small bunkhouse out back, a man so quiet and reclusive she had almost forgotten he existed. Barlow cursed under his breath. The distraction was only for a second, a flicker of his eyes toward the old man. But it was enough. In that split second of indecision, Ellie pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, a physical blow of sound that slammed into her, that shook the very air. The rifle kicked back with a vicious force, slamming the stock into her shoulder and sending a jolt of pain through her entire body. The smell of gunpowder, sharp and sulphurous, filled her nostrils. She hadn't aimed, she had just fired. The man holding Tom screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and shock. He staggered back, dropping the knife, his hand flying to his shoulder where a dark, wet stain was already spreading across his shirt. The bullet had gone wide, missing the boy by a miracle, and had torn through the fleshy part of the man's shoulder. Tom, released, scrambled away, crying, and ran to the corner of the room. The standoff was broken. The dynamic had shattered. They were no longer facing a helpless girl. They were facing a shotgun and a girl who was, however erratically, shooting back. Barlow was a bully, not a general. This wasn't the easy victory he had planned. "Let's go," he snarled. He grabbed his injured man, who was cursing and clutching his shoulder, and half dragged him toward the door. He gave one last, venomous look at Ellie, a look that promised a future reckoning. Then they were gone, stumbling out into the bright sunlight. A moment later, Ellie heard the frantic sound of hooves as they galloped away, the sound fading until it was once again swallowed by the vast silence of the valley. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was terrifying. It was a ringing, echoing quiet. Raoul stood in the doorway, the shotgun still held at the ready. Tom was huddled in the corner, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Silas lay on the floor, unmoving, and Ellie stood in the middle of the room, the heavy rifle still in her hands, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel. The peace had been shattered, the sanctuary had been violated, and she, a girl who had only ever wanted to run and hide, had just fired a gun for the first time in her life. The world had changed forever. The roar of the rifle faded, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. It pressed in on Ellie, a ringing, humming void where the violence had been. For a long, frozen moment, no one moved. The sharp, sulphurous smell of gunpowder hung in the air, a harsh perfume of survival. Ellie stood, locked in place, the heavy Winchester still clutched in her hands, its terrible power a live, humming thing against her skin. Her gaze was fixed on the man lying so utterly, unnaturally still on the floorboards. Silas. The mountain had fallen. It was Raoul's voice that finally broke the spell, his words low and steady, cutting through the haze of shock. "Let me have that child." He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of an old man. taking the rifle from her unresisting hands. Her fingers uncurled from the stock, numb and useless. He leaned the Winchester against the wall and knelt beside Silas, his gnarled fingers gently probing the back of Silas's head. Ellie watched, her breath catching in her throat. Tom, who had been a small, silent ball of terror in the corner, uncurled himself and crept forward, his wide, frightened eyes never leaving his father's still form. "He's alive," Raoul announced, his voice a gravelly reassurance. "Breathing steady, but he took a bad knock. We need to get him to his bed." The task seemed impossible. Silas was a giant, a dead weight of muscle and bone. But Raoul's quiet competence was infectious. He directed Ellie, his instructions simple and clear. "Get his arms. I'll take his feet. Tom, you open the door to his room. That's a good lad." Somehow, they managed it. It was a slow, grueling, undignified process, a desperate shuffle and drag across the wooden floor. Ellie's arm screamed with the strain. Her shoulder, bruised from the rifle's kick, throbbed with a dull, insistent fire. But they got him to his room, to the simple rope bed with its horsehair mattress. They maneuvered him onto it, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He lay there, his face pale beneath its weathered tan, his breathing a shallow, rhythmic whisper. He was utterly helpless. The man who had been her shield, her immovable protector, was now as vulnerable as a child. In that moment, something inside Ellie shifted. The last remnants of the terrified, fleeing girl were burned away, replaced by a fierce, cold resolve. She had brought this trouble to his door. His injury was her fault, and she would be the one to see him through it. The hours that followed bled into a long, nightmarish day. Raoul, with a practicality born of a long, hard life, took charge of the world outside the bedroom. He nailed a board over the broken front door, his hammer blows echoing the violent rhythm of the fight. He tended to the animals. He made sure Tom ate. He was the anchor that kept their small, shattered world from drifting completely away. Ellie's world, however, shrank to the four walls of Silas's room. It became a universe defined by the rise and fall of his chest, the faint whisper of his breath. She sat in a hard-backed wooden chair beside his bed, a basin of cool water and a stack of clean rags on the floor beside her. She became his guardian, his keeper. She bathed the wound on his head with a touch so gentle she barely seemed to make contact. The skin was broken, matted with blood and hair, and a deep, ugly bruise was already purpling the area. She cleaned it as best she could, her stomach churning, her hands refusing to tremble. When she was done, she found a bottle of whiskey in the kitchen and, remembering some old tale of her grandmother's, poured a little on a clean cloth and used it to sterilize the wound. Silas didn't so much as flinch. As the day wore on, a fever began to set in. His skin, cool at first, grew warm, then hot to the touch. A faint sheen of sweat beaded on his forehead. Ellie began a new rhythm, the constant, patient work of keeping the fever at bay. She soaked a rag in the cool water, wrung it out, and laid it across his forehead. She bathed his face, his neck, his wrists. When the rag grew warm from the heat of his skin, she would dip it again, the cycle repeating over and over. Tom came and went, a small, silent ghost. He would stand in the doorway for long stretches, just watching. Then he would come in and sit on the floor by Ellie's chair, taking out a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper Raoul had given him. He began to draw. He drew his father, a huge, powerful figure with fists like boulders. He drew 3 small, crooked stick figures with angry faces. Then he drew a girl, taller than the stick figures, holding a long, straight line the rifle. He drew for hours, processing his terror through the quiet, methodical scrape of charcoal on paper. Night fell. Raoul brought Ellie a bowl of stew. She hadn't realized she was hungry until the savory smell reached her. She ate it quickly, never taking her eyes off Silas. Raoul checked on his patient, his expression grim in the flickering lamplight. "Head wounds are a tricky business," he said, his voice low. "Only two things to be done. Keep him cool and pray. The rest is up to him and the Lord." He placed a gnarled hand on her shoulder for a brief second. "You're a good girl. You get some rest. I'll watch him for a bit." But Ellie shook her head. "I'm not leaving him." And she didn't. The night was an eternity. She dozed in the chair, her head nodding forward, but some internal alarm would jolt her awake every few minutes. She would immediately reach out, her hand going to his forehead to check his temperature, her eyes straining in the dim light to see the steady, reassuring rise and fall of his chest. She whispered to him in the darkness, the words spilling out of her in a quiet, continuous stream. She told him about her day, about the weeds she had pulled, about Tom's drawings. She told him he was strong, that he had to fight, that he couldn't leave them. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she couldn't bear the silence. The second day was the same, and the third, a timeless, exhausting vigil of cool water, whispered words, and watchful waiting. She learned the sound of his every breath, the slightest shift in his stillness. She forced tiny sips of water between his cracked lips from the tip of a spoon, her heart in her throat, until she saw the faint, convulsive movement of him swallowing. He was a great, silent ship, adrift on a dark, unknown sea, and she was a tiny, determined vessel, trying to guide him back to shore. It was late on the third night. A storm had rolled in, and a soft, steady rain was drumming on the roof. Tom was asleep on a pallet of blankets in the corner. Raoul had long since gone to his bunkhouse. Ellie sat in her chair, her head resting against the wall, her body a single, profound ache of exhaustion. The lamp was turned down low, casting long, dancing shadows. She was watching his face, tracing the hard lines of it in the dim light. The weathered skin, the thick beard, the closed eyes. He was so still, too still. A sudden, cold fear gripped her, and then his eyelids flickered. She sat bolt upright, her heart stopping. It was a movement so small, she thought she might have imagined it. She leaned closer, holding her breath, her eyes locked on his. Another flicker. A low groan rumbled in his chest, and then, slowly, as if they were immensely heavy, his eyes opened. They weren't focused at first. They were cloudy, confused, looking at the ceiling. Then they shifted, moving slowly around the room, before finally coming to rest on her face. He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, his lips parted, and a dry, rasping sound came out. He swallowed and tried again. His voice, when it came, was a mere ghost of itself, a cracked, hoarse whisper. "Still here." The two simple words broke through the dam of her exhaustion, her fear, her carefully controlled resolve. A great shuddering sob escaped her. Tears she hadn't even known she was holding back began to stream down her face, hot and unstoppable. But through the tears, a smile bloomed, a smile of such profound, bone-deep relief that it felt like the sun rising after a lifetime of darkness. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his large, still ones. His skin was cool now. The fever had broken. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with tears, her smile trembling. "Yes, Silas, still here." His eyes closed then, not in unconsciousness, but in what seemed to be a deep, weary acceptance. And for the first time in 3 days, Ellie let her own eyes close, her head resting on the edge of his bed, her hand clutching his, and fell into a true, dreamless sleep. The days that followed were a slow, arduous journey back to the world of the living. Silas was awake, but he was weak, a giant tethered by his own frailty. He slept most of the time, and when he was awake, a fog of confusion and pain seemed to surround him. He would try to sit up, a flash of his old strength returning, only to fall back against the pillows, a grimace of frustration on his face. Ellie became his anchor to the world. She was a constant, gentle presence at his side. The fierce protector had become the tender nurse. She made him thin broth from the broth of a tough old hen Raoul had sacrificed for the cause. She would sit on the edge of his bed, the bowl in her lap, and feed it to him one spoonful at a time. The first time, he turned his head away, a flash of proud refusal in his eyes. "I can do it," he rasped, his hand weakly attempting to take the spoon. "No, you can't," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not yet. Just let me." And he did. The simple, intimate act became their new ritual. It was a delicate dance of dependence and care, a complete reversal of the roles they had played since the day they met. She would read to him sometimes, from an old, battered book of psalms she found on a shelf, her voice a low, steady murmur in the quiet room, and she would talk to him, filling the silence with stories of her day, of Tom's latest adventure, of Raoul's grumbled complaints about the weather. He rarely responded with more than a grunt or a nod, but she knew he was listening. His eyes would follow her as she moved about the room, a silent, watchful gaze that was slowly losing its cloudy confusion and regaining its old, steady intensity. One afternoon, a week after the attack, he was sleeping. She sat in her usual chair, mending a tear in Tom's shirt, the needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. The rain had passed, and the room was filled with the clean, golden light of late afternoon. She looked at him, at the way the light fell across his sleeping face. She saw the new silver threads in his beard, the faint, pale scar that would always remain on the back of his head. She thought of the terrified girl who had begged to hide under his coat, a girl who felt like a stranger to her now. She reached out and gently took his hand, holding it in both of her own. His fingers were still weak, but they curled slightly around hers. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper meant only for him, for the quiet room, for her own heart. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, the truth of the words surprising her as she spoke them. Not of Barlow, not of being alone, not of anything. She looked at his peaceful, sleeping face, and a feeling of profound certainty settled deep within her. "Not since I met you." The violence of the attack did not fade quickly. It left an echo, a ghost that haunted the edges of their quiet days. For weeks, a sudden noise would make Ellie flinch, and Tom would wake in the night from bad dreams, his small cries a sharp reminder of the fragility of their peace. Silas himself was a changed man. The blow to his head had stolen some of his raw, physical certainty, replacing it with a slower, more deliberate way of moving. He was quieter than ever, but his silence now seemed less about a deep and lonely grief, and more about a watchful, patient observation of the new life taking root around him. The true healing began not in a single moment, but in the steady, relentless rhythm of the days that followed. As Silas's strength returned, so did the pulse of the ranch, the world, which had contracted to the four walls of a sick room, slowly expanded to encompass the yard, the barn, the corral, and finally, the far-flung fence lines that marked the boundaries of their life. It was a life built of small, repeated actions, each one a thread woven into the tapestry of a family. Every morning, Ellie would rise before the sun, the first to break the stillness of the house. She would light the fire in the cook stove, the scrape of the match and the soft whoosh of the kindling catching fire, a signal that the day had begun. The smell of coffee and frying bacon would soon fill the small house, a comforting, domestic scent that chased away the last of the night's shadows. Silas would emerge from his room, moving with a stiffness that lessened with each passing week. He would nod to her, a silent greeting that spoke volumes, and accept the tin cup of coffee she held out to him. They would stand in the quiet kitchen, the rising sun casting long, golden shafts of light through the window, and drink their coffee in a comfortable, shared silence. It was a ritual, a quiet communion that needed no words. After the attack, Tom had clung to Ellie, a small, silent shadow who needed the constant reassurance of her presence. But as the fear receded, replaced by the certainty of waking up in the same safe place each morning, his natural boyishness began to reemerge. His solemnity gave way to curiosity, and his curiosity blossomed into play. His laughter, at first a rare and startling sound, became a regular feature of the afternoons. It was a clear, bright sound that seemed to wash the dust from the air. He would chase the chickens, his small legs pumping, or build intricate forts of twigs and stones by the water trough. Raoul, who had been a reclusive figure before the attack, seemed to adopt the entire household. He became their grizzled, watchful grandfather. Most evenings, after the work was done, he would settle into a worn rocking chair on the porch, lighting his pipe with a gnarled thumb. The sweet, pungent smell of his tobacco smoke would drift on the evening air. He would sit there, a silent sentinel, watching Tom play in the yard, watching Ellie tend to her small, burgeoning garden, watching Silas methodically sharpen a tool. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a steadying force, a quiet affirmation that all was as it should be. He was the witness to the family they were becoming, as late summer burned into the hot, dry heart of the season. Silas began the arduous task of mending the fences on the western edge of the valley. It was hard, physical labor, the kind of work that had defined his life. He would leave early in the morning with a sack of tools and a canteen of water, and he would not return until the sun was low in the sky. It was his way of reclaiming his strength, of reasserting his dominion over this small patch of land. He was rebuilding the walls, both literal and metaphorical, that kept them safe. One afternoon, the heat was a suffocating blanket over the valley. Ellie, watching from the house, saw him working far out on the plain, a solitary figure under the vast, indifferent sun. On impulse, she drew a fresh, cool bucket of water from the well, filled a wooden dipper, and carried it out to him. The walk was long, the ground hot beneath her worn shoes. As she drew closer, she could hear the rhythmic thud of his post-maul, a steady, powerful heartbeat against the silence of the desert. He was stripped to the waist, his back and shoulders a landscape of corded muscle, gleaming with sweat. The scar on the back of his head was a pale, thin line against his sun-darkened skin. He didn't see her approach until she was almost upon him. He stopped, leaning the heavy maul against a newly set post, and watched her come, his blue eyes squinting against the glare. She didn't speak. She simply held out the dipper of water. He reached for it, his large, calloused hand closing over hers as he took it. His skin was hot and gritty with dust. Hers was cool and smooth. The contact was brief, a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the heat. It was a moment of profound and startling intimacy, more powerful than any embrace. Their eyes met, and in his gaze, she saw a deep, aching tenderness that stole her breath. It was a look of gratitude, of wonder, of a quiet, dawning affection that mirrored what was in her own heart. He broke the gaze first, lifting the dipper and drinking the water in long, slow draughts. When he was finished, he handed it back to her, their fingers brushing once more. "Thank you, Ellie," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had ever said her name. She simply nodded, unable to speak, and turned back toward the house, her heart hammering in her chest. It was not a declaration of love. It was something quieter, deeper. It was a promise of care, of partnership, of a shared life. Their love story was written in these small, silent gestures. There were no whispered words of affection in the moonlight, no grand pronouncements. Theirs was a love expressed in the language they both understood, the language of action. It was in the way she mended the worn collar on his favorite shirt, her stitches small and neat. It was in the way he built a small, sturdy bench for her and placed it in the shade of the porch, so she would have a comfortable place to sit and watch the sunset. It was in the way they moved around each other in the small confines of the house, a graceful, practiced dance of two people who had learned the rhythms of each other's souls. One morning, while walking along the dry creek bed, Ellie found a single, stubborn desert marigold pushing its way up between two stones. It was a small, perfect explosion of defiant yellow against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. It seemed to her a symbol of their own lives, a small bit of beauty and resilience thriving in a harsh and unforgiving world. She picked it carefully and carried it back to the house. She didn't know what to do with it. Handing it to him felt too bold, too forward, so she left it on the top step of the porch, where she knew he would see it when he came in for his midday meal. It was a small, anonymous offering, a secret she shared only with the sun and the sky. She watched him from the kitchen window. He came up the steps, paused, and looked down. He saw the flower. He stood looking at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he bent down, his large frame moving with a surprising gentleness, and picked it up. He didn't put it in his buttonhole or tuck it behind his ear. He simply held it in his palm as he came inside. Later that evening, after Tom was asleep and the house was quiet, she saw him sitting at the small, rough-hewn desk where he kept his ranching ledgers. A lamp cast a warm, golden circle of light around him. In his hands was the small, yellow flower. She watched, hidden by the shadows of the doorway, as he opened a thick, leather-bound book. He turned the pages carefully until he found a clean, empty spot. Then, with a slow, deliberate tenderness, he placed the flower on the page and closed the book, pressing the small, bright piece of her into the permanent record of his life. Ellie slipped back to her room, a lump in her throat and a profound, quiet joy singing in her heart. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. He had taken her simple, fragile gift and made it a treasure. He had told her, in his own silent way, that she mattered. And so, their life settled into its seasons. The fierce heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. Tom's laughter filled the yard. Raoul's pipe smoke scented the evening air. Silas's steady presence was the solid foundation of their world, and Ellie's quiet, gentle care was the heart that made it a home. There was no name for the love that grew between them in that lonely valley. It had never been spoken aloud, but it was there, in every mended fence, in every shared meal, in every fleeting touch of hands. It was a love as quiet and as patient as the turning of the stars, and as solid and enduring as the ancient, silent stones of the desert itself. The seasons turned, and the raw wound of the attack slowly began to scar over, becoming a part of the land's memory. Like an old rock slide or a lightning-scorched tree, the fierce, desperate fight for survival gave way to the steady, quiet work of living. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek bed a brilliant, fleeting gold, and the air grew crisp and clean. Carrying the scent of pinon smoke from the chimney, the fragile shelter had become a home, its foundations settling deep into the earth, held fast by the invisible mortar of shared experience and unspoken affection. Their lives were a quiet braid of three, with Raoul as the steady, anchoring hand holding the strands, Silas, Ellie, and Tom. They moved through their days with a familiar, practiced rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. The sharp edges of their individual griefs and fears had been worn smooth by the constant, gentle friction of their life together. It was an evening in late autumn, one of those rare, perfect days when the world seems to hold its breath. A recent rain had washed the dust from the air, leaving the sky a deep, aching violet at the eastern horizon and a riot of molten gold and fiery orange in the west, where the sun was beginning its slow descent. The light that filled the valley was thick and golden, the kind that makes memories. It gilded the edges of the porch, turned the blades of the windmill to bronze, and set the windows of the small house ablaze with reflected fire. On the porch, Raoul sat in his rocker, The gentle creak of the wood, a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the evening stillness. The first star of the evening, Venus, was a brilliant pinprick in the deepening sky above his head. He puffed on his pipe, the smoke a fragrant gray cloud around his weathered face, his old eyes watching the scene before him with a quiet, satisfied contentment. In the meadow that sloped down from the house, a miracle had occurred. The rains had awakened a dormant sea of wildflowers, and the dusty green of the valley floor was now a breathtaking carpet of purple verbena and golden desert marigolds. And in the middle of this explosion of color, Tom was running. He was no longer the solemn, watchful child who had first met Ellie. He was a boy, pure and simple, his small body alight with the sheer joy of being alive. He chased a pair of monarch butterflies, his laughter a bright, clean sound that carried on the still air, a sound more beautiful than any bird song. Silas and Ellie stood side by side at the edge of the porch, leaning against the railing, watching him. They stood close, not touching, but Ellie was intensely aware of the warmth and solidness of him, of the vast, quiet space his presence filled. He had regained his full strength, the slowness and uncertainty of his recovery now gone. But something had changed in him. The haunted emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. He was still a man of few words, a man carved from the silence of the mountains. But his silence was no longer a wall to keep the world out. It was a space of comfort, of understanding, a place where she felt utterly and completely safe. She watched Tom, her heart swelling with a feeling so profound it was almost painful. This boy, who was not hers by blood, had become the anchor of her heart. This man, who had been a terrifying stranger on a train, had become her entire world. The life she was living, a life of simple, honest work, of quiet evenings and peaceful mornings, was more than she had ever dared to dream of. It was a gift, a miracle forged in the crucible of violence and fear. She looked from the laughing boy to the silent man beside her. She saw the way the golden light caught the silver in his beard, the way his faded blue eyes were soft as they watched his son. She saw the strength in his hands as they rested on the porch rail, the same hands that had pulled her from a moving train, that had fought for her, that had gently dried the dishes beside her, that had pressed her small, hopeful flower into the pages of his life. And she knew, with a certainty that settled into the very marrow of her bones, that this was where she belonged. The running was over. The words rose in her, not from a thought, but from a deep, elemental need to give voice to the truth that had taken root and blossomed inside her. Her fear of the past, her fear of Barlow, her fear of what the world could do to a girl alone, all of it seemed to belong to another person, another lifetime. Silas had not just saved her life. He had given her a new one. He had shown her that she was not a piece of property to be owned, but a person to be protected, to be cherished. She turned her head slightly to look at him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in her chest. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, a soft sound meant only for him, easily lost in the vastness of the evening. "At first," she began, her gaze fixed on his strong, weathered profile, "I only asked to hide under your coat." He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. The world seemed to fall away. There was only the golden light, the quiet porch, and the deep, unwavering blue of his gaze. He didn't speak, but she saw the question in his eyes, the patient waiting. She took a small, steadying breath. "Now," she said, her voice clear and sure, "I want to stand beside you, in the rain or in the sun, for the rest of my life." The declaration hung in the air between them, as simple and as profound as a vow. It was everything she had to give her past, her future, her heart. She had laid it all at his feet and waited, not in fear, but in quiet, hopeful certainty. Silas did not speak. Words were not his language. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his eyes searching hers. and in them, she saw a universe of emotion, the memory of his own deep loss, the surprise of this new, unexpected joy, and a love so deep and powerful it needed no sound. His hand, the one resting on the railing, moved. He covered her hand with his. His touch was warm and firm, his calloused palm a familiar, comforting weight over her knuckles. And then, his fingers tightened, a slow, gentle pressure that was more eloquent than any poem, more binding than any ring. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was an acceptance. It was everything. He held her gaze for another moment, then looked back out at the valley, at his son, at their world. He kept her hand pinned beneath his, a silent, possessive, and profoundly gentle claim. The sun touched the horizon, and the light deepened to a soft, rosy glow, bathing them in its warmth. After a long time, he released her hand and straightened up. He looked down at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his eyes. He gave a slight nod toward the meadow of flowers where Tom was now sitting, carefully examining a ladybug on his finger. It was an invitation. Together, they stepped off the porch and began to walk, side by side, down into the field. Their steps fell into a natural, easy rhythm, their shoulders occasionally brushing. They were not running from the wreckage of their pasts anymore. They were walking toward their future, a future that was as bright and as full of improbable beauty as the field of desert flowers that bloomed at their feet. They were standing still, together, in the heart of the vast, wild land that had tried to break them and had, instead, brought them home. And they were choosing to love. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect with you and hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give us an extra boost, hit the hype button to help share this story with even more listeners.